The black Mercedes pulled up to the grand entrance of Harmony Music Academy, its engine purring like a satisfied cat. Out stepped Alexander Hartwell, adjusting his expensive watch and straightening his tailored suit jacket. At 35, he was what most people would call a musical genius. His violin had taken him to stages across the world, from London's Royal Opera House to Tokyo's prestigious concert halls. Alexander looked up at the Academy's impressive stone facade with its tall windows and ivy-covered walls. This wasn't just any music school. Harmony Academy was where wealthy families sent their children to learn from the best. The monthly fees here cost more than most people made in a year. And today Alexander was here as their special guest instructor. He walked through the marble lobby, his leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. Students hurried past him, carrying their instrument cases and sheet music. Some whispered as they recognized him. After all, his face had been on magazine covers and concert posters for years. Just last month, his performance at Carnegie Hall had received a standing ovation that lasted 15 minutes. "Mr. Hartwell, welcome." A tall woman in a crisp blue dress approached him. This was Mrs. Patterson, the Academy's director. She practically glowed with excitement. Having Alexander teach here, even for a few weeks, would boost the school's reputation tremendously. "The students are so thrilled to learn from you," she continued as they walked down the hallway lined with portraits of famous musicians. "We've prepared our best practice room for your master classes." Alexander nodded, barely listening. He was used to this kind of treatment. People always got excited when he showed up. It came with being one of the world's top violinists. He'd started playing when he was just 4 years old. By age 10, he was performing with orchestras. By 20, he had won every major competition there was to win. The practice room was everything he expected. A beautiful grand piano sat in the center, its black surface so polished you could see your reflection in it. Comfortable chairs were arranged in a semicircle for the students. The walls were lined with expensive wood paneling, and large windows let in plenty of natural light. "Your first class starts in 10 minutes, Mrs. Patterson said, checking her watch. "Is there anything you need?" "Just peace and quiet," Alexander replied, unpacking his violin case. Inside lay his most prized possession, a violin made in 1734 by Giuseppe Guarneri. It was worth more than most people's houses. As students began filing into the room, Alexander studied each one. They all looked the part, well-dressed, carrying expensive instruments, moving with the confidence that comes from privilege. These were the children of doctors, lawyers, and business owners. They'd had the best teachers money could buy since they were small, but as the lesson began, Alexander's mood started to sour. The first student, a teenage girl with perfectly styled hair, attempted to play a Mozart concerto. Her technique was textbook perfect, but something was missing. There was no soul in her playing, no emotion. It was like listening to a very expensive computer program. "Stop," Alexander said, raising his hand. The girl's bow froze mid-stroke. "What are you trying to say with this piece?" The student looked confused. "Say?" "I'm just playing the notes as written," Alexander sighed. This was what was wrong with modern music education. These students had been taught to play the notes correctly, but they had no idea what the music actually meant. They were like parrots, repeating sounds without understanding. The next student wasn't much better. A young man played a batch piece with technical skill but zero understanding. When Alexander asked him about the emotional journey of the composition, the boy just stared blankly. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time," Alexander said, his voice getting sharper. "It's about telling a story, sharing emotions, connecting with something deeper. You people are just making noise." The students shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. This wasn't what they'd expected from a master class with a world-famous musician. They thought he'd praise their playing and maybe give them some technical tips. Instead, he seemed almost angry with them. As Alexander continued his criticism, he noticed someone moving quietly around the edges of the room. It was a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing a simple gray uniform. She was the cleaning lady, emptying trash cans and dusting surfaces while trying not to disturb the lesson. What caught Alexander's attention wasn't her presence. Service staff were invisible to him most of the time. It was the way she moved. Every time a student played, she would pause in her work, her head tilted slightly as if she was really listening. When the music was particularly beautiful, even if the student was struggling, her eyes would close for just a moment, like she was savoring the sound. Alexander found this annoying. Here were students paying thousands of dollars for his time, and they seemed to care less about the music than the cleaning lady did. It felt like an insult to everything he'd worked for. The problem with most people, he said, his voice carrying across the room, is that they think music is easy. They think anyone can do it. They hear a beautiful piece and imagine they understand it, but understanding and being able to create are completely different things. The cleaning lady glanced up for just a second when he said this, then quickly returned to her work. But Alexander had seen something in her eyes. Was it hurt? Anger? He couldn't tell, and he didn't really care. The lesson continued with more of the same. Student after student played with technical skill but no real understanding. Alexander's comments became increasingly harsh. He talked about natural talent versus pretending to understand music. He mentioned how some people were born to be musicians while others were just fooling themselves. By the end of the 2-hour session, the students looked defeated. These were young people who had been told they were gifted their entire lives. They'd won local competitions and impressed their private teachers. But here was one of the world's greatest musicians telling them they were essentially musical frauds. As the students packed up their instruments and left, Alexander felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction because he'd told them the truth about their playing. Frustration because he wondered if any of them would actually improve based on his criticism. The cleaning lady was still there, now wiping down the piano with careful attention. Alexander watched her work for a moment. She treated the instrument with obvious respect, her movements gentle and precise. When she finished, she stood back and looked at the piano for just a moment, the way someone might look at a beautiful painting in a museum. "Excuse me," Alexander said. The woman turned, looking surprised that he was speaking to her. "Yes, sir?" "You seem to enjoy the music," he said, not entirely sure why he was starting this conversation. She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd seen all day. "Music is beautiful, sir." "Even when it's difficult?" Alexander nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant by that. He packed up his violin, already thinking about tomorrow's lesson and wondering if these students would ever truly understand what it meant to make real music. He had no idea that the quiet woman cleaning the room knew more about music than anyone else in the building. 3 days had passed since Alexander's first master class, and his mood had only gotten worse. Each session was the same disappointing story. Students with expensive instruments and perfect posture, but absolutely no soul in their playing. It was like watching robots programmed to hit the right notes at the right time. This morning's class was particularly frustrating. Alexander had chosen one of his favorite pieces to work on, a violin and piano duet by Brahms. It was a beautiful composition that told the story of two lovers separated by war, their voices calling to each other across an impossible distance. In the right hands, it could make people cry, but these students were butchering it. The first pair to attempt the duet was Rebecca, a 17-year-old violinist whose parents had bought her a violin worth more than most cars, and James, a pianist, who'd been taking lessons since he was 5. On paper, they should have been perfect. Both had won regional competitions. Both had studied with expensive private teachers. Both could read music like most people read books, but when they played together, it sounded like two separate people playing two completely different songs in the same room. "Stop, stop, stop," Alexander called out, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. The music died immediately. What was that supposed to be? Rebecca looked confused. "The Brahms duet, sir. We played all the notes correctly." "All the notes correctly," Alexander repeated, shaking his head. "Do you think that's what music is about? Just hitting the right keys and strings in the right order?" He walked over to the piano and played a simple melody with one finger. It was just a basic scale, nothing fancy. But somehow, the way he played it made it sound beautiful. Music is about connection, he said. It's about two people having a conversation without words. What you just played sounded like two people in different rooms, talking to themselves. James, the piano player, shifted uncomfortably. We practiced together for hours, sir. We were perfectly synchronized. Synchronized, Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think music is about being synchronized? A metronome is synchronized. A clock is synchronized. But music is about feeling. He gestured toward the sheet music on their stands. This piece is about love and loss, about hope and despair. When Brahms wrote this, he was thinking about his own heartbreak, but you two played it like you were reading a grocery list. The other students in the room watched this exchange with growing discomfort. They'd all been taught that playing the notes correctly was the most important thing. Their teachers had always praised them for their technical skills. But here was one of the world's greatest musicians telling them that everything they'd learned was wrong. Alexander continued his criticism for another 20 minutes, picking apart every aspect of their performance. He talked about how the violin should sing like a human voice, how the piano should provide not just accompaniment but emotional support. He demonstrated passages on his own violin, showing them how the same notes could sound completely different when played with understanding, but the more he taught, the more frustrated he became. The students nodded and took notes, but he could see in their eyes that they didn't really get it. They were trying to understand music like it was a math problem to be solved. As the lesson dragged on, Alexander noticed the cleaning lady again. She'd been in every class this week, always working quietly in the background. Today, she was organizing sheet music that students had left scattered around the room. But just like before, she would pause whenever someone played something beautiful, her head tilting slightly as if the music was calling to her. It was starting to irritate him. Here were students paying thousands of dollars for his expertise, and they seemed to care less about the music than someone who was just there to empty the trash cans. It felt like a joke, like the universe was mocking him. The second pair of students wasn't any better than the first. If anything, they were worse. The violinist had good technique but played with all the emotion of a robot. The pianist rushed through the difficult passages, more concerned with showing off than with serving the music. Enough, Alexander said, cutting them off mid-phrase. This is painful to listen to. He began pacing back and forth in front of the piano, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Do you know what the problem is with modern music education? Everyone thinks they can be a musician. Everyone thinks that if they take enough lessons and practice enough hours, they'll magically become artists. The students exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the encouraging masterclass they'd expected. But the truth is, Alexander continued, real musical understanding is rare. It's a gift. Either you have it or you don't, and most people don't. As he said this, his eyes fell on the cleaning lady. She was standing near the piano now, holding a stack of sheet music. When she heard his words about musical understanding being rare, something flickered across her face. It might have been sadness or maybe disagreement. But she quickly looked down and continued organizing the papers. Something about her reaction annoyed Alexander even more. Who was she to look sad about his comments? What could she possibly know about the struggles of being a real musician? An idea began forming in his mind. A cruel idea, but one that would prove his point perfectly. If he really wanted to show these privileged students what he meant about the difference between real musicians and ordinary people, why not use a living example? You know what? He said, stopping his pacing suddenly. I think I need to demonstrate my point more clearly. All eyes in the room turned to him. The students looked nervous. Wondering what he had planned now, Alexander walked over to where the cleaning lady was standing and cleared his throat. Excuse me, he said loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear. She looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. Yes, sir? You're always here during our lessons, he said, his voice taking on a theatrical quality. You seem to really enjoy listening to the music. Yes, sir. Music is very beautiful, she replied quietly, clearly uncomfortable with suddenly being the center of attention. Beautiful, Alexander repeated, turning back to face his students. She thinks music is beautiful. How lovely. He walked over to the piano and pulled out the most difficult piece of sheet music he had with him. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging pieces ever written for piano. Even professional pianists spent months preparing to perform it. "Since you find music so beautiful," Alexander said, placing the sheet music on the piano stand, "and since you're always here listening to our lessons, surely you've learned something about how music works." The cleaning lady stared at the sheet music, her face going pale. The students watched in uncomfortable silence, realizing what Alexander was planning to do. "Come on," Alexander said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "Don't be shy. Show my students here what real musical appreciation looks like. Play this piece for us." The room was completely silent except for the sound of the cleaning lady's footsteps as she slowly approached the piano bench. Her hands were shaking slightly as she sat down and looked at the incredibly complex music in front of her. Alexander turned to his students with a satisfied smile. In a few moments, when she inevitably failed to play even the first few measures, his point would be proven. These students would finally understand the difference between real musical talent and simply appreciating music from a distance. He had no idea that he was about to receive the shock of his life. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as the cleaning lady sat at the piano bench, staring at the sheet music that Alexander had placed before her. The Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 stared back at her from the page, its black notes scattered across the staff like an impossible puzzle. Alexander stood behind her with his arms crossed, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This would be over in seconds. She'd probably press a few random keys, realize she was in way over her head, and excuse herself from the room. Then he could turn to his students and explain, once and for all, the difference between appreciating music and actually being able to create it. The students sat frozen in their chairs, unsure whether to look away or watch this uncomfortable scene unfold. Some of them felt sorry for the woman. Others were curious to see what would happen. But all of them could sense that something significant was about to occur. The cleaning lady's hands hovered over the keyboard for what felt like an eternity. Her fingers were trembling slightly, and she kept glancing back at the sheet music as if hoping it might transform into something simpler. For a moment, it looked like she might stand up and walk away. Then something changed. Her shoulders straightened. Just a little. She took a deep breath and placed her hands gently on the keys. Her fingers found their positions with a familiarity that made Alexander's eyebrows furrow slightly. Most people who had never played piano before would struggle just to find middle C, but her hands seemed to know exactly where they belonged. She played the first note. It was soft, tentative, like she was testing the water before diving in, but it was the right note. Not just right in terms of pitch, but right in terms of feeling. There was something in that single note that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. Then came the second note. And the third. What started as hesitant exploration began to transform into something else entirely. Her left hand joined her right, and suddenly the opening melody of one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written was flowing from her fingers. Like water from a spring, Alexander's smile began to fade. The woman's touch on the keys was unlike anything he'd heard from his students all week, where they played with technical precision but no soul. She played with a warmth and understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Every note had purpose. Every phrase had meaning. As she moved into the more complex passages, something magical happened. The trembling in her hands disappeared completely. Her posture became more confident. It was as if the music itself was giving her strength, reminding her of something she had forgotten. The students watched in amazement as this quiet woman, who they had barely noticed before, began to play with a skill that surpassed anything they had ever achieved. Her fingers danced across the keys with impossible grace, navigating runs and arpeggios that would challenge even professional pianists. But it wasn't just her technical ability that was stunning everyone in the room. It was the emotion in her. Playing, the Rachmaninoff Concerto tells a story of struggle and triumph, of darkness giving way to light. And somehow, this woman was telling that story with every note she played. Alexander felt his world beginning to shift. This wasn't supposed to happen. This cleaning lady, this ordinary person in her simple gray uniform, was playing better than students who had studied for years. Better than some professionals he had worked with. Better than he had thought possible. As the music continued, the woman seemed to transform before their eyes. The hesitant, apologetic person who had been organizing sheet music just minutes before was gone. In her place sat someone who belonged at that piano, someone who understood the music not just intellectually, but in her very bones. The most difficult section of the concerto was approaching, a passage that required both hands to perform completely independent complex patterns while maintaining perfect timing and emotional expression. Alexander had seen seasoned professionals stumble over this section. Surely this was where the performance would fall apart. Instead, the woman attacked the passage with a ferocity that took everyone's breath away. Her hands moved with impossible speed and precision, but never once did the music become mechanical. If anything, this was where her playing became most expressive, most human. Alexander found himself gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white. His mind was racing, trying to understand what he was witnessing. People didn't just accidentally know how to play Rachmaninoff. This level of skill, this depth of understanding, came from years of serious study and practice. The students were equally stunned. Some had their mouths hanging open. Others were leaning so far forward they were almost falling out of their chairs. They had never heard playing like this in person. It was the kind of performance you might hear on a professional recording, but here it was happening right in front of them, performed by someone they had thought was just part of the cleaning staff. As the piece continued, the woman's playing only grew more confident and expressive. She wasn't just hitting the right notes, she was interpreting the music, making choices about tempo and dynamics that showed a deep understanding of what the composer had intended. Her performance was beginning to tell a story, and everyone in the room was completely caught up in that story. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and roared. In her hands, the piano became an entire orchestra, capable of expressing every human emotion. When the music called for gentleness, her touch became as light as a feather. When it demanded power, her hands became forces of nature. Alexander realized that his mouth was hanging open and quickly closed it. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from what was happening at the piano. Every assumption he had made, every cruel comment he had prepared, was crumbling around him. The other students had stopped taking notes. They had stopped checking their phones. They had stopped thinking about anything except the music that was filling the room and somehow reaching into their hearts and souls. For the first time all week, they were experiencing what Alexander had been trying to teach them about the power of music to move people, to tell stories, to connect human beings to something larger than themselves. As the piece built toward its climax, the woman's entire being seemed to be channeled through her fingers. She swayed slightly with the music, her eyes closed, completely lost in the world that Rachmaninoff had created, and that she was now recreating for all of them. The final section approached, a triumphant conclusion that required not just technical mastery but the ability to convey overwhelming joy and victory. Alexander held his breath, still part of him hoping that she would finally falter, that his worldview would remain intact. Instead, she played the ending with such power and beauty that several of the students found themselves blinking back tears. The final chord rang out in the practice room, hanging in the air like a benediction, and then there was silence, not the uncomfortable silence from before, but the kind of silence that follows something truly extraordinary, the kind of silence that falls when people have just witnessed something that has changed them forever. The woman's hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted them and placed them in her lap. Alexander stared at her, his mind completely blank. Everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, about who deserved to be called a musician, had just been turned upside down. The question that had been forming in his mind for the past several minutes finally found its way to his lips. Who are you? The question hung in the air like the last note of her performance. Who are you? Alexander had asked, but even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The woman at the piano bench looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. Those hands that had just performed a miracle now seemed ordinary again, working hands with calluses and small scars that spoke of years of labor. But Alexander had seen what those hands could do. He had heard the music. They could create. She started, then stopped. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The confidence that had filled her during the performance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The students remained frozen in their chairs, afraid that any movement might break the spell of what they had just witnessed. Some of them were still trying to process what had happened. They had watched someone they had dismissed as unimportant transform into one of the most skilled musicians they had ever seen. Alexander took a step closer to the piano. His earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by genuine curiosity and something else, perhaps the first hint of respect he had shown anyone all week. "Please," he said, his voice gentler than it had been since he arrived at the academy. "I need to understand." The woman looked up at him, and for the first time Alexander really saw her face. Behind the tired eyes and the worry lines, there was something he recognized, the look of someone who had lived and breathed music for years. It was the same look he saw when he looked in the mirror. "My name is Lisa," she said finally. "Lisa Chung, and I used to be a pianist." Used to be. Those three words carried so much weight that several students leaned forward to hear better. "Used to be?" Alexander repeated, settling into a chair across from her. His usual commanding presence was gone. Now he just looked like someone trying to understand a puzzle. Lisa's hands moved away from the keys and folded in her lap. "I was born in Taiwan," she began, her voice growing steadier as she talked. "My parents owned a small restaurant, but they saved every penny so I could take piano lessons. I started when I was 5 years old." She paused, lost in the memory. "My teacher said I had natural talent. By the time I was 10, I was performing in local competitions. By 15, I had won my first national competition in Taiwan." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just talking to someone who could play piano well. He was talking to someone who had been destined for greatness. "When I was 18, Lisa continued, I won a scholarship to study music in America at Juilliard." Several students gasped audibly. Juilliard was the most prestigious music school in the world. Getting a scholarship there was like winning the lottery, except it required incredible talent instead of luck. "I spent 4 years there, studying with the best teachers in the world. After I graduated, I started performing professionally. I had a recording contract with Sony Classical. I performed with major orchestras in New York, Boston, Chicago." Alexander's mind was reeling. Lisa wasn't just some talented amateur. She had been a professional musician at the highest level, but that raised an obvious question. What happened? He asked quietly. Lisa's composure began to crack. Her eyes filled with tears, and she took several deep breaths before she could continue. "I was 26, she said. "I had just finished a tour across Europe. My manager had booked me for a series of concerts with the London Symphony Orchestra. It was going to be the biggest break of my career." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing a little of the dust from her cleaning work across her cheek. "I was driving home from a rehearsal in downtown Los Angeles. It was raining and the roads were slippery. A truck ran a red light and hit my car on the driver's side. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing." Even Alexander, who had seen his share of tragedy in the music world, felt his stomach tighten. "I woke up in the hospital 3 days later," Lisa continued. "The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, but when I tried to move my left hand," she held up her left hand and flexed her fingers slowly. "To most people, it would look perfectly normal. But Alexander, with his trained eye, could see the slight stiffness in her movements, the way her pinky finger didn't quite extend as far as it should. The damage was to the nerves and tendons," she explained. "The doctor said I might regain some function with physical therapy, but I would never have the fine motor control needed for a professional piano performance. Alexander felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He knew what that meant for a pianist. It would be like telling a painter they could never hold a brush again, or telling a writer they could never type. My recording contract was canceled, Lisa said, her voice becoming flat and emotionless. The orchestra concerts were given to someone else. My manager stopped returning my calls. In the music world, if you can't perform, you don't exist. One of the students, a young violinist named Rebecca, spoke up for the first time. But you just played perfectly, she said. Better than any of us ever could, Lisa smiled sadly. It took me 8 years of physical therapy to get to this point. 8 years of exercises and stretching and slowly rebuilding the connections between my brain and my fingers. But by then, I was 34 years old. I had been out of the music world for almost a decade. No one remembered me. No one cared. Alexander was beginning to understand the full tragedy of what had happened. In the classical music world, careers were built on momentum. Take a few years off and you might as well start over from zero. Take 8 years off and you were forgotten entirely. I had medical bills from the accident that destroyed my savings, Lisa continued. I couldn't afford to live in New York anymore, so I moved here to Los Angeles. I applied for teaching positions at music schools, but they all wanted people with recent performance experience. I applied to play with local orchestras, but they weren't interested in someone who had been away from music for so long. So you took a job cleaning, Alexander said, finally understanding. I took whatever work I could find, Lisa said. But I couldn't stay away from music completely. When I saw there was an opening for custodial work at a music academy, I jumped at the chance. At least here I could be around music again, even if I couldn't perform it. But you've been practicing, Alexander said. Your playing today wasn't just muscle memory from years ago. You've been working on it, Lisa nodded. After hours, when the building is empty, I sometimes come in here and practice. The academy director doesn't know. I always make sure everything is locked up and cleaned before I leave. I just I needed to play again, even if no one would ever hear me. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the academy's beautiful grounds. Everything made sense now. The way she moved around the room during lessons, always listening. The way she treated the instruments with such respect. The way she had looked when he made his comments about people pretending to understand music. How long have you been working here? He asked. 3 years, Lisa replied. 3 years of listening to lessons and remembering what it felt like to be a real musician. Alexander turned back to face her, and for the first time since he had arrived at the academy, he felt genuinely ashamed of himself. Here was someone who had achieved everything he had achieved, maybe more. Someone who had lost it all through. No fault of her own. And he had treated her like she was nothing. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. I had no idea. Lisa shook her head. How could you? I'm just the cleaning lady now. That's all anyone sees. But as Alexander looked at her sitting at that piano, he saw something else entirely. He saw a fellow musician who had been silenced by circumstances beyond her control. He saw someone whose talent had never died, even when the world had forgotten about it. And suddenly he knew exactly what he needed to do. Alexander stood by the window for a long moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Behind him, Lisa remained at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, probably wondering if she would lose her job for what had just happened. The students sat in stunned silence, still trying to process everything they had heard. When Alexander finally turned around, there was something different in his eyes. The arrogance that had defined him all week was gone, replaced by a determination that his students had never seen before. Stand up, he said to Lisa, his voice firm but kind. She looked confused but did as he asked, stepping away from the piano. Bench? No, Alexander said, walking over to her. I mean, stand up as a musician. You've been hiding for too long. He turned to face his students, who were watching this exchange with fascination. Do you all understand what just happened here? He asked them. You just witnessed one of the most talented pianists I've ever heard, and I've heard them all. Rebecca, the young violinist, raised her hand tentatively. But she works as... She works as a cleaning lady because the world failed her, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger. Because when life knocked her down, no one was there to help her get back up. Because the music industry is so focused on the next young talent that it forgets about the ones who already proved themselves. He walked back to Lisa, who was standing near the piano looking overwhelmed. But that ends today. Mr. Hartwell, Lisa said quietly, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but my time has passed. I'm 34 years old. In the classical music world, that might as well be ancient. Alexander shook his head firmly. Age is just a number. Talent like yours doesn't have an expiration date? He pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. Please don't, Lisa said, panic creeping into her voice. I can't handle any more disappointment. I've built a life here. It's not the life I dreamed of, but it's stable. I can't afford to hope again. But Alexander was already dialing. Margaret? It's Alexander Hartwell. I need you to clear my schedule? For next month. No? Everything. I found someone you need to hear. Lisa watched in disbelief as Alexander spoke with what was clearly his agent or manager. The students leaned forward, trying to catch every word of the conversation. I want to organize a special concert, Alexander continued into the phone. A benefit concert for musicians who've overcome adversity. And I want this pianist to be the featured performer. Yes, I'm serious. Margaret, in 20 years of performing, I've never heard anything like what I just heard. When he hung up, the room was completely silent. Lisa stared at him like he had lost his mind. You can't be serious, she whispered. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Alexander replied. But first we need to get you back into performance shape. How often have you been practicing? Maybe 2 or 3 hours a week late at night when no one's here, Lisa admitted. That's not nearly enough, Alexander said. From now on, you're going to practice every day. I'm going to arrange for you to have access to the best practice rooms in the city. He turned to Mrs. Patterson, the academy director, who had slipped into the room during the conversation and was standing by the door with her mouth hanging open. Mrs. Patterson, Alexander said, I assume you heard what just happened? She nodded, still speechless. Good, Lisa is no longer your custodial staff. As of today, she's a guest artist in residence. I want her to have full access to all practice facilities, and I want her schedule cleared so she can focus on music. Mrs. Patterson found her voice. Mr. Hartwell, I don't understand. What's happening here? Alexander gestured toward Lisa. What's happening is that you've had one of the world's most talented pianists cleaning your floors for 3 years, and none of us were smart enough to notice. He walked over to his violin case and pulled out his phone again. I'm also going to call my friend David, who runs the LA Chamber Orchestra. They're always looking for exceptional soloists. Alexander, please, Lisa said, using his first name for the first time. You don't understand how hard it was when everything fell apart before. I can't go through that again. Alexander stopped dialing and looked at her seriously. You're right. I don't understand what you went through. I've been incredibly fortunate in my career. I've never faced the kind of challenges you've overcome. He sat down in one of the student chairs, bringing himself to her eye level. But I do understand music. And what you played today wasn't just technically perfect? It was filled with something that most musicians spend their entire careers trying to find. What's that? Rebecca asked. Truth, Alexander said simply. When someone has experienced real loss, real struggle, it changes their music. It gives it depth that you can't fake or learn from a book. He looked around at his students. You've all been playing music like you're trying to impress someone, like you're performing for a grade or a competition. But Lisa plays like she's sharing her soul with the world. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I fail again? What if my hand gives out during a performance? What if people don't want to hear from someone who's been forgotten? Alexander stood up and walked to the piano. He played a simple melody, the same one he had played earlier to demonstrate a point to his students. But this time, he played it with all the emotion and understanding he had learned from watching Lisa. "Fear is normal," he said as he played. "Every musician deals with fear. But you know what's worse than failing? Never trying at all." He stopped playing and turned to face her. "Besides, you won't be doing this alone. I want to perform with you." The students gasped. Alexander Hartwell didn't perform with just anyone. He was known for being incredibly selective about his collaborations. "You want to perform with me?" Lisa asked, incredulous. "I need to perform with you," Alexander corrected. "Today, you taught me something that I had forgotten. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." He walked back to where she was standing. "All week, I've been criticizing these students for playing without emotion, for not understanding what music really means, but I realized that I've been guilty of the same thing. I've been so focused on technical perfection and maintaining my reputation that I forgot about the joy of making music." Alexander turned to his students. "And all of you, you've been so worried about playing the notes correctly that you forgot why those notes were written in the first place. Music isn't about impressing people. It's about connecting with them." Over the next several weeks, everything changed at Harmony Academy. Alexander extended his residency and completely transformed his teaching approach. Instead of focusing solely on technical perfection, he started teaching his students about the stories behind the music, about how personal experiences could inform their playing. Lisa began practicing with the intensity she hadn't felt in years. Her muscle memory returned quickly, but more importantly, her confidence began to rebuild. Alexander arranged for her to work with a physical therapist who specialized in musician injuries, helping her strengthen her left hand even further. The other students at the academy became Lisa's biggest supporters. They loved having a real professional musician to learn from, someone who could share stories about performing with world-class orchestras. Lisa, in turn, found joy in teaching again, something she hadn't been able to do in years, 3 months. Later, the concert that Alexander had promised actually happened. The venue was the Walt Disney Concert Hall, one of the most prestigious performance spaces in Los Angeles. The program featured Alexander and Lisa performing together, along with several of the Academy students who had been inspired by their story. The night of the concert, Lisa stood backstage in a beautiful black dress, her hands shaking with nerves and excitement. It had been almost 9 years since she had performed in front of an audience. "Ready?" Alexander asked, adjusting his bow tie. Lisa took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready?" As they walked onto the stage together, the audience erupted in applause. Lisa sat at the grand piano and looked out at the crowd, nearly 2,000 people who had come to hear her play. She placed her hands on the keys and began the opening notes of the same Rachmaninoff concerto she had played that day in the practice room. But this time, she wasn't playing for someone who was trying to humiliate her. She was playing for people who believed in her, who wanted to hear her story told through music. The performance was everything Alexander had hoped it would be and more. Lisa played with a passion and skill that brought the audience to their feet. When the final notes faded away, the applause lasted for nearly 10 minutes. Backstage after the concert, Lisa found Alexander surrounded by music industry executives and journalists, all wanting to know more about the remarkable pianist they had just discovered. "So what's next?" one reporter asked Lisa. She smiled, thinking about how different her life had become in just a few months. "I'm going to keep playing," she said simply. "And I'm going to keep teaching. There are a lot of young musicians who need to learn that talent isn't just about technical skill. It's about perseverance, about finding your voice even when the world tries to silence it." Alexander nodded approvingly. He had learned that lesson too.